It's a good transition because I'm talking about DePIN token economics. So the restaking is a key piece that would actually goes on top of the projects and what I'm talking about. So first, this is sort of an obvious point. Why do token models matter? And what I basically say is that project success must accrue value to the token. And it may sound obvious, but the point is doesn't matter. It's the only thing that matters, because if it doesn't work that way, then another project is going to come along and figure out something that does work that way and win, get more traction, get more customers, generate more value. So your project better be about the token or you're going to lose. That's sort of point one. And that may not be, it may sort of, people sort of think that, but I don't think that has sunk in overall, because some token models are really kind of designed at the end. And the next thing is, why is DePIN different? And if you compare it to DeFi in particular, DePINs have fiat costs and fiat revenue. And that's very different than DeFi, for which there's this closed ecosystem of tokens, borrowing, lending, paying in other native tokens. And so because you got fiat costs and fiat revenue, you have different dynamics at play. What also, the upside of that, however, is that your investor universe is potentially much larger. Traditional investors will see revenue going in and realize that this is actually something that they can potentially invest in and understand in a way that DeFi is too esoteric, too theoretical, and too hard to value. On top of it, we're at a point now where revenue traction in DePIN is coming. And DePIN projects have revenue, but I think we're 12 months away from, whether it's Helium or XNet or GeoNet, real revenue coming in from real Web2 companies that will all of a sudden have the penny drop. But when that happens, everyone is going to wonder, how's that revenue translate to token price? And there's a lot of scrutiny on that at that point from traditional investors, not just crypto investors who traditionally haven't been as focused on these models. So let's talk about token uses. There's issuance, and then there's demand and use. So issuance is reward usually, and potentially for payment. And so those are pretty obvious. And the demand and use, we just heard a lot about staking, and that's a big part. But it's actually, in the DePIN sector, staking is actually only used in the kind of compute or digital services arena. It's not used as much in the real asset, in the real physical networks area. And obviously burning and governance. So let's divide it into those two sectors, those two kind of categories, and then go through them a little bit and understand what they all kind of sort of disaggregating token models into all the constituent pieces, so you can see how they each work and what projects are using which. So for payment, this is kind of the first most obvious model that a lot of crypto companies use. And a bunch use it in DePIN. The idea is, if you use it for payments, people need to buy your token and use it. Great. In reality, I'm not sure there's evidence that will lead to a higher token value, because you can buy and sell immediately. Someone can buy, use it, and the person who receives it can sell it immediately. Will that can lead to volume? Does it lead to appreciation? Not super clear. The other point, obviously, is that if you require tokens for payment, that can impair your adoption, because you want real users, real Web2 users. The actual adoption, when you have to use a token, falls off dramatically. There's a particular DePIN project that in their pipeline, 90% of their pipeline drops off when it comes time to install the wallet to use their token for payment. And I can't think why you would want your process to have a piece that you lost 90% of your funnel with that piece. And that's what happens when you would require token payments. That's not a popular opinion, I think, because we're all accustomed to using tokens in payment ecosystems. But for DePIN to scale, it has to take fiat. And we'll talk about that more. So token for payment is widely used, but I think it is going to be less widely used in the future. Now, token for rewards is critical. This is what we've seen for bootstrapping a network, and this is a core crypto use across all kind of crypto ecosystems. And you can see a large number, and there's many more than this, by the way. The ones I'm using are ones that I know somewhat well. There's obviously plenty more that would fit in this category. But when you're using rewards, that provides revenue prior to providers, prior to network traction and to actual revenue. And I think that is super, really good because it helps you boost the supply side prior to demand coming. So you can prove to your customers that you actually have a significant network. Now, challenges is that you run the risk of generating too much supply and burning through some of your tokens and diluting your rewards. That's kind of one element that there's also a possibility. So how are the rewards calibrated? Is it per user? Is it a set amount of tokens? Is it is it just divided among all providers? Does it matter where the providers are? There's a whole number of questions here. In certain projects, if you look at some of these, for example, like GeoNet is going to reward users in specific locations more than others because they want to fill out the world. HiveMapper gives you rewards. Again, they give rewards based on where you drive. So if you're driving in the middle of nowhere, you probably won't get the rewards. They also do boosts where you get more rewards if you drive when there's a particular demand for a certain map, right? So with Fluence, the rewards are based on just you add in your CPUs to the network, you will get rewards based on the CPUs being online. Relatively simple. These all just because they're giving rewards doesn't mean the model is the same. And if you take your rewards and pay attention to the model, you can really drive the type of usage that you want your network to have. And so to do so, you have to really carefully address these questions. The biggest point, though, is the last one, which you're dependent on the crypto market. And so if you're just paying out rewards, they're denominated in crypto, people could make a ton of money in one market and very little in another market. So you have to be very cognizant of how you do that. One way to do it is I'll talk about it later, is maybe denominate in fiat. But it's that is a key piece of this token rewards. And I think you'll see a graph later. I don't know a project in DePIN that doesn't reward with tokens, right? That's one thing that everybody does. How it's done is pretty variable, however, and I think that makes a big difference. Now let's talk about use. So tokens for staking. Now this is really pretty much constrained to projects that offer digital services. So Filecoin does it, Fluence, LivePeer. There's others that also require stake. Those are three that I'm certain of. And the reason you do this is because you need to prove trust. And when you put stake in a node, that stake can be slashed or could be burned if that node doesn't act appropriately. And so what this does is it allows customers to rely on either anonymous or pseudo-anonymous providers because there's economics at stake and there's an economic incentive. That is a very without that, I don't think these networks work, right? So stake, I think, is for the networks that use stake, those networks really have a difficult time operating if stake isn't there. And I think that is a core use of it. The other point with stake, though, is how is that stake calibrated? With Filecoin, 30% of circulating supply has to be staked. That's great, but it's a rather arbitrary number. With Fluence, the stake is a dollar amount per node. That is a different model. And LivePeer, the amount you stake entitles you to a certain amount of the revenue of the network. You stake 10%. If you have provided 10% of stake, you receive 10% of network revenue. So it's correlated in that way. So each of those companies has very different stake models. So again, just because they're staking doesn't mean it's all done the same way. And then the other key thing is here, do providers have to do the stake? And again, many projects, whether IONET, Filecoin, it's the actual providers do the stake. Fluence, we've determined that instead any investor can delegate stake. So that opens up the staking universe much more broadly and also lowers costs for the providers. And then finally, how does the stake relate to the value of the services? That's another point. Are you staking $1 million for providing a little bit of service or not? And that also gets back to the Filecoin 30%. That could be a huge value. At one point, 30% of circulating supply was billions and billions of dollars. Now it's less than that. So how does that relate to the supply and the security you are trying to protect? And then this, I think, is related to stake, is used more than stake, but is the real choice, most effective use for the physical networks as opposed to digital infrastructure networks. And here you can see a number of networks that are physical. Render is actually an exception here, but Helium is connectivity, Glow is solar, Render is rendering video, GeoNet is location, XNet is telephonic services. And each of these basically take revenue, and when the platform generates revenue, that some portion of that revenue goes into the market, buys tokens, and burns them. And the great part about that is you can then say, okay, if the protocol is generating X revenue, I project it to generate this revenue, I now know how much demand there will be for tokens, which will be bought and burned. That means you always are going to have a demand for that token because every dollar of revenue, some part of that is going to buy and burn tokens. So I think that is a terrific link between platform success, platform revenue, and token demand. Now, the question is, that sounds great, but then there's a couple nuances to it. How much gets burned? There's one protocol out there that's burning 5%. Is that really going to make the difference? I'm not sure. Others, I think, XNet is burning, GeoNet is burning about 80%. So there's a big range in terms of what percentage is burned. The most important thing, I think, is it's fixed. So investors can count that X% of revenue at a minimum will be burned. And obviously, the higher that is, the more value accrues to the token. Another nuance to this, some models here reward the actual nodes or infrastructure that has actually provided the service. So if you look at, there's one particular network that burns only 5%, and most goes to reward the actual devices that provided the service that people paid for. And that is, I think, another interesting way to go about it. It is harder to manage, harder to affect, and a little bit harder to explain. But I think that is another good way to do it. The other point here, obviously, is that this is not as good for marketplaces because revenue is coming in to the protocol. Protocol is buying the token and burning it. And so that's different than usually the digital services where revenue is coming in and then going to the digital service providers, going to the hosts, going to the storage providers, et cetera. It doesn't work as well here unless you sit in the middle. For example, Render, people are paid in Render tokens, and when revenue comes into the Render network, Render then buys and burns tokens. So it, I guess, is the exception here in providing digital services where there's a buy and burn mechanism. And so that I think it is a one of the exceptions, but it's still doing it it's doing it in a similar way. So I think this is a very I think you're going to see crypto projects that don't have buy and burn ultimately have to move here, because if they don't, there is not a real native or external demand for their token. And then the last use is governance. So token-based voting used in DAO, this is a use. Does it lead to value? Unclear. The way I think it maybe leads to value is if you're forced to lock your token up for different amounts of voting rights. And there are certain models where people, if you lock your token up for X amount of time, you get twice the votes, double that, 4 times the votes, et cetera. And that can lead to locking, which is useful, and lead to scarcity, which is good. It also adds to complexity. So it's also not entirely clear that leads to higher values or to better outcomes, but it is a good way. It's another kind of tool, I suppose. And that goes back to the challenges here for DAOs. How do you get participation? And then the other point is, and we've seen this happen before, some DAOs can be attacked. If you add low participation and you add to that some of the high token multiplier mechanisms, you can end up with a very small amount of tokens having a huge impact and potentially voting to do things that are not necessarily in the interest of protocol, like distribute treasury or unwind treasury or make payments to related parties, etc. So you have to be very careful if you use any of these more token boosting mechanisms, that they're not then subject to an attack because of low participation, and you just given a couple groups a huge voting power because they locked up for a while that then can unwind you in a couple ways. And we've seen some attacks like that. So, we also think there's legal wrappers you should have, and maybe a check on DAO votes as well. That is some type of temporary check. At Fluence, we've instituted a governing council that can veto a DAO vote, but that governing council is elected by the DAO every 2 years. So effectively, they can only, if it is they are in fact going against the actual will of the community, they can be voted out in 2 years. So they can't hold it up forever. I think that is a nice balance, but there are other mechanisms as well. So here is just a very busy slide that shows just as somewhat of an arbitrary list of projects. I will add more, but you probably wouldn't even be able to read it even less. But the points to take away here is reward is used by everybody, but how it's used is different. And that is really the important bit, right? It's not almost every one of these, like, we mentioned Demo here. Demo is shares information from drivers. You get tokens reward when you sign up for Demo. You then get more rewards if you share more data with Demo, and those rewards just scale down over 40 years. Different, it's very different from like Fluence, where it's per core, per month, etc. Flat, like that's it. And Helium is different as well. And HiveMapper, as I mentioned, changes rewards based on a whole number of criteria, right? So it rewards, how each reward is calibrated is different. Governance, I think, is pretty much consistent all the way across. You see here is where the distinction is. And you see stake is only done by a couple, because if you're actually providing the infrastructure, it's less of a need to stake. It's hard to ask someone who bought a HiveMapper camera or installed Demo to also stake. That's not really necessary. And that hardware is already trusted, right? HiveMapper made that. They can see the data coming from you. There isn't as much of a need to provide that trust. Demo, you're sharing your own data. There's not as much of a need to stake tokens to provide that trust. But that's where buy and burn comes in, as I've mentioned before. And the projects that don't have buy and burn, I think you will see move to that over time. I just was talking today with someone at Aether, with someone at IO.net, and I think they're instituting a buy and burn as example. So keeping all these up to date and consistent is also a challenge, because they're constantly iterating and evolving, and this is an early ecosystem. So I think you will see more iteration, more changing. But if you're investing, I'd be very focused on buy burn and how that works and how that ties in, because that, I think, is what's going to ultimately drive token value. So some takeaways here is that no one model is consistent across projects or works for all of them. Rewards is key, but how it works is also really important, because that's going to drive the issuance. And then obviously buy burn and stuff. I mentioned this, and here's this fiat front end is important, and this is actually a really important piece that I think hasn't yet sunk in really. But rewards, we're accustomed to arbitrary token amounts. You get 50 tokens for doing this or 100 tokens for doing that. Why is it that amount? How much is that worth, and how much does that value fluctuate over time? And how much does that fluctuation reduce the actual adoption of what you're trying to do? And I think that volatility is not good. What we've done at Fluence is we've linked it to a fiat value. So you're getting $10 per core per month in our token. I think that helps a lot. And also for use, is the stake an arbitrary token amount, or is it linked to fiat value? And again, I think over time, these closed token ecosystems are going to evolve to have somewhat of a fiat link, because that is how we calibrate tokens anyway. You're checking your token price based on dollars. You're not checking it based on other tokens. And so here's the other way to look at this. If you want to design a token system, everyone's always worried about a low price and people kind of losing interest if the token price goes down, right? Everyone knows that if your token price goes to really low, then rewards will be worth less. Your ecosystem is impaired. Everyone's worried about that, and rightly so. We've seen plenty of market falls, but the other issue is a high token price is also a problem. Where if you can make so much money because token price is so high, that may encourage behaviors that are counterproductive to getting customers on your network. And so we've seen this in the digital asset space, where token price was so high that storage providers didn't care about onboarding real storage. They were making plenty of money just doing proof of storage capacity and making rewards on that. That did not help generate real customers and real demand for some storage networks. And so you also have to be a bit where in Hivemap were even recalibrated because tokens were so high, drivers were just driving to earn tokens without adding real value to the network. So you also have to worry about that. So only in the middle is it really the sweet spot. And that middle could be a good place, but both ends are really dangerous. And so this is just an example where you can calibrate rewards in fiat, but you pay in a token. And so this is somewhat arbitrary, but at $2, for example, if your reward is 600, you would get 300. This is just FLT as an example. But then if the token price fell to 50 cents, you're going to get 1,200 FLT. You still get the $600. And so when you're doing this type of design, the actual provider knows with really good degree of certainty that they're going to get a certain amount in dollars. Now, this amount will fluctuate. It releases over time. It's never going to be exactly $600, but in this type of volatility, which by the way isn't crazy, right? 50 cents to $2. We've seen moves like that 4x all over the time in crypto. And if your business is based on it being at $1, you're maybe out of business at 50 cents, and at $2, you may be making so much you don't care about actually serving revenue. So now this can't go infinitely low, right? So this doesn't protect you against a token at 0 where you issue unlimited amount. But this concept, I think, helps attract the people in the network, the providers who are interested in earning a stable amount, not just mooning a crypto. And I think that is a very important part that I think is I think we will see more and more interest in. And that also goes back to the demand side of the token, where if you also have stake, you have a similar concept where you need to stake at $2, you need to stake 12,000, but at 50 cents, you have to stake 24,000. If you do that, now as the token falls, there's more and more demand for that token, because to enter the network, you have to purchase more of it in order to get the stake. And I think that is also a very important and underappreciated piece of our token ecosystems. Is you, as a token falls, it's more important that there's demand for that token, and that will help reduce that volatility as you have more buyers and stakers need to buy more to do it. Conversely, when the token goes up, when it comes time to restake, there's excess stake. They can either sell it or they can stake a whole nother node as well. So it actually, I think, either leads to network growing in terms of CPUs, or you maybe have selling up here and buying down here, again, reducing volatility, which I think is a positive. So I guess I'd say, to sum this all up, no models work across all DePINs, but I think they're going to evolve, and I think clear buy and burn are going to be very important. And I think the real thing about DePIN, the the best news is traditional investors are coming and are coming very soon, but they're going to want very clear answers on token models, and they're going to want to see a link to revenue. And the projects that can have those answers are going to attract capital, are going to have token prices increase, and are ultimately going to win. So I guess I just say pay close attention to how they work and how these and what we see in the market in terms of what's working and what's not. So thank you for your attention. Any questions? No, everyone's got it. All right, there we go. Great, thanks.